Minister Dermer, welcome to 7:30.
Good to be with you, Sarah.
124 countries are signed up as parties to the International Criminal Court. Now, if the judges issue warrants for the arrest of Mr. Netanyahu and Mr. Gallant, the authorities in those countries would be obliged to arrest them. How could Mr. Netanyahu continue as Prime Minister in those circumstances?
Well, I don't think it's going to affect what Israelis feel about this, because they think the charges are outrageous and dangerous. They're outrageous not just because it created a false symmetry between the leaders of a terror organization, Hamas, and Israel's prime minister and defense minister, but because it's also false charges. The idea that Israel is trying to starve the population in Gaza or intentionally killing civilians in Gaza, people reject it. You should know, Sarah, I don't know if you covered this, but 106 members of the Israeli Knesset, 106 out of our 120-member parliament, basically signed on to a resolution that rejects the decision of the ICC. So this is not something that is internally a political issue in Israel. I think they reject it. I think they think that it's a farce. And hopefully the judges will throw this case out. And if they don't, then I hope some of these countries will not accept it, because the ICC doesn't have jurisdiction over these cases.
Well,
that's something that many of countries have stated, and including and especially the United States.
Let me ask you about that, because of course Australia is one of those countries. Would you expect Australia, for example, to comply with those warrants?
No, I would hope it would not. I don't think Australia has recognized a Palestinian state. The only basis for the ICC's jurisdiction is they accepted the Palestinians as a state. You know, there's a discussion right now, two-state solution, not a two-state solution. How do we move forward? But the ICC made that decision several years ago, and that's what gave them the hook to claim that they have jurisdiction. They don't have jurisdiction on Israel, by the way, for another reason, is that we have an independent court system. And one of the things the ICC is supposed to look at is there an independent court system that is not functioning, that doesn't actually investigate? And what this person did is, instead of coming to Israel, he was supposed to come here next week to look at the situation for himself. Instead, he ran out, gave a press conference, these false and libelous charges against Israel. And we are where we are. And hopefully Australia, as a fair-minded country and a fair-minded people, will reject this decision.
All right, let me ask you that, because in fact, the leader of the opposition here in Australia says he is open to cutting ties with the International Criminal Court. Are you urging the Australian government to withdraw from the ICC?
I didn't know that, but I'm very glad to hear him say that. I think that sentiment is widely shared also in the United States on both sides of the political aisle. I think it's very likely we're going to see sanctions in the United States, maybe even as early as today or tomorrow. Secretary Blinken, Secretary of State of the United States, appeared before Congress yesterday and said that the administration would support it. Of course, the U.S. is not a member of the ICC, but I didn't know that the head of your opposition had said that. I applaud him for doing it. What exact action Australia would take regarding the ICC, I don't know, but I think it's very important to defang any potential decision and say, look, we don't accept that you have jurisdiction over the case, and whatever you decide, Israeli prime ministers, defense ministers, soldiers, whatever, are always welcome in Sydney and the rest of Australia.
Well, let's talk about some of the allegations, because that will obviously become part of the debate here, as well, of course, in the rest of the world. So the ICC alleges that Mr. Netanyahu and Mr. Gallant have directed attacks against civilians and willfully killed civilians. Do you accept, first of all, that it is a war crime to target civilians?
If you're targeting willfully, of course, but just we haven't done it.
Now,
I mean, Israel, you should understand, Sarah, that the foremost expert on urban warfare who teaches at West Point, and General David Petraeus, they both said that no country in the history of urban warfare has taken more precautions to get people out of harm's way. The rules of war are very clear.
Let me just jump in, because I've heard you make that point a few times since this issue of the arrest warrants came up. I just want to bring you to a much more recent statement from the Biden administration, said that Israel, despite having the knowledge and experience for mitigating civilian harm, has likely violated international law for protecting civilians. So I don't think you can rely on the United States as your backer in terms of how you have conducted the war.
Well, actually, I will hope that you'll actually take a tape of Joe Biden, not from months ago or weeks ago, from about 2 days ago, when he said that Israel has not intentionally targeted civilians. Obviously, civilians are killed in warfare. It's a terrible thing, and it's a tragedy. We've had situations where we've lost dozens of soldiers because of friendly fire. We had this terrible situation where 3 hostages were able to escape their captors, and unfortunately, they were seen as enemies and they were killed by our soldiers. Obviously, we don't intend to do it. This is what happens in warfare. It is terrible. But if you look at the civilian versus combatant ratio in Israel, it is unprecedented in warfare. It's much better than you saw in the United States, and I'm sure Australia was part of those operations in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere.
Let's talk about what's. I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm just conscious of getting through some material in the time, but let's talk about a little more about this, because the latest confirmed casualties of children is more than 7,000, women nearly 5,000. But let's just be frank, the world has seen the results of your bombing campaign, street after street after street. We've seen the destroyed apartment buildings. How were all of those, with their civilian inhabitants, legitimate military targets?
Did you see Berlin, the pictures from Berlin from 1945?
I'm asking you
Did
about,
you see what
I'm
happened
asking
in
you
Japan?
about Gaza.
No, because you're fine, and I'll answer about Gaza. And if you let me finish a few sentences, I'll actually be able to make a couple of points. If you want to interview yourself, you can go ahead and do that. But a couple of points in Gaza. What we have done is taken unprecedented measures to get the civilians out of harm's way. Right now, Israel is operating in Rafah, and 950,000 people have been moved from the war zone. Countries that are intentionally targeting civilians don't drop millions of leaflets and make phone calls to people to get them out of harm's way. We have taken action that no other country has. The rules of war are very clear. You have to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. You have to actually use proportionate force, and you have to exercise precaution. That is exactly what Israel has done from the beginning of the war. You mentioned the issue of children. Every child who is killed in a war is a tragedy. But those numbers now have been revised almost in half. As of 3 weeks ago, the UN was saying that Israel killed 15,000 children were killed in this war in Gaza. Now that number is 8,000.
I think you'll find that I quoted the latest figures, but I want to come back to that.
No, that's right, but they've been revised. They've been revised because what happens is, Sarah, people are using the Hamas Health Ministry statistics. There was a case, you remember, at the beginning of the war, 10 days into the war,
I'm concerned about wasting. I'm sorry about using time on issues that have been covered in the beginning of the war.
If you don't want an answer. If you don't want an answer, I want to actually deal with the reports and the statistics that you're citing. So there was a case 10 days into the war where a hospital was hit by a rocket. Everybody thought Israel was responsible. There were headlines around the world which said at least 500 people, Palestinians, were killed. Innocents were killed at that hospital. Turns out it wasn't Israel. It was Islamic Jihad. And this remarkable thing happened. For the first time in 2,000 years, people were resurrected in Israel, because then there were only 50 to 60 casualties. But that 500 number was still in the UN numbers. So I would ask people in Australia, a fair-minded people with in a fair-minded country, wait until all the facts are there. When you see the facts, you will see that Israel has acted with great care to avoid Palestinian civilian casualties against an enemy that embeds itself in hospitals, schools, mosques, and does everything to put their civilians into harm's way. We're doing everything to keep them out of harm's way.
Let's go to the second rung of allegations, or the next rung of allegations from the ICC. And this is about using starvation as a weapon of war. Now, I just want to take one measure of the suffering from many that have been presented by international aid agencies, as well as by your allies. UNICEF says 50,000 children under 5 are suffering from acute malnutrition. Why has Israel allowed this?
First of all, we haven't allowed it, and it hasn't been our policy. And I think that is the most outrageous libel against Israel. I sit in the war cabinet, and from day one, our policy was to enable basic humanitarian assistance to reach those people in need. We've had over a half a million tons of humanitarian assistance, including 400,000 tons of food, 20,000 trucks of food we have enabled to move into Gaza. And so the whole idea that Israel has a policy of starvation is absurd. You might not know this number. 20,000 Americans 2 years ago died of malnutrition. There have been 32 people in Gaza who supposedly have died of malnutrition. Everybody who would die of malnutrition, that is a tragedy. Israel has no policy of trying to prevent humanitarian assistance and certainly food from coming into Gaza. So this whole case is libelous against Israel. I think it's terrible. And the ICC prosecutor should have come to Israel and learned the facts rather than making this charge against Israel.
Who should the judges listen to? UNICEF or Benjamin Netanyahu?
Benjamin Netanyahu, because he's a leader of a democratic society. I don't know anything about UNICEF. I don't know what that organization is about. You take an organization like UNRWA, it's a refugee agency. Half of them are people who work for UNRWA, are first-degree relatives of Hamas. 10% actually are part of Hamas's military arm. 24 of this UN agency, 24 of their personnel perpetrated the attacks of October 7th. I'm not trying to smear UNICEF. They may do tremendous work all over the world. But the fact is that in Gaza, most of those people are beholden to Hamas. And any free and independent voice there will probably get shot in the back of the head if they send a report that is not the report that Hamas wants. The people of Gaza suffer because of Hamas. The best thing we can do is get rid of Hamas and give the Palestinians a different future. And of course, make Israel more secure.
Now, no one is disputing the intense misery inflicted on the people of Gaza by Hamas. That is beyond question. However, you just used the number of trucks, for example, that Israel has allowed into Gaza. 25,000 is the number that your Prime Minister used. Before the war, the average of trucks should now be at 75,000. Why shouldn't Israel be held accountable for the suffering of people when humanitarian aid has been reduced by the amount that is evident in those figures?
So as they say, there's Mark Twain once said, a great American writer, there's lies, damn lies, and statistics. You just said a statistic of the number of trucks before the war. What you didn't say is the number of trucks before the war was not humanitarian assistance. It was all commercial goods going into and out of Gaza. There's not the same level of commercial activity now as it was before October 7th. But actually, humanitarian assistance is greater today than it was on October 7th. There are more food trucks, your listeners should hear this, there are more food trucks going into Gaza today than there were before October 7th. Of course, the local market has been hit. The agricultural produce within Gaza has been hit. But there's more food and humanitarian assistance that is going into Gaza today than went in before the war. Israel is supplying water, actually in much greater quantities than we supplied at the beginning of the war. Around 7% of Gaza's water supply was provided by Israel on October 7th. Today, it's around 45%. So Israel's doing food, water, medicine, doing everything we can to flood humanitarian assistance in. You see it reflected, Sarah, in the precipitous drop of prices in Gaza are down 80 or 90%. Generally, markets don't lie. When there's more supply, the prices go down.
Yes,
that's what's happening in Gaza.
These
allegations
let me just
of
put this
famine
to you.
are false.
I didn't use the word famine. What I'm putting to you is a range of opinions expressed by every single aid agency that is operating inside Gaza, including the Friends of Israel. It comes back to the question I posed to you before. Should the judges in the ICC who will decide on these warrants make their determination based on the opinion of every aid agency in the world operating in Gaza, or your comments and those of your Prime Minister?
They should make their opinion based on the facts. They should look at the facts. If they follow the facts, I have no doubt that they will throw these attempt to get arrest warrants out, because the charges are completely baseless. What is happening in Gaza, and you said it before, Hamas is responsible for huge suffering in Gaza, and not only putting the civilians in harm's way, but also the humanitarian assistance. They are stealing the food. They are extorting the people of Gaza. They are denying people who won't maybe fight for them or do this or that thing for them. And that's what they do for the aid agencies. You may remember at the beginning of the war, you may have covered it on your show, that in one UN agency in in Gaza, they tweeted out that Hamas has stolen all of our supplies. That tweet lasted for several hours because the person's life was threatened and they had to take that tweet down. Hamas is trying to present a picture to the world that is false. So I hope these judges, if they're as fair-minded as the people of Australia and the leaders of Australia, hopefully they will get beyond what reports are coming out to Gaza, see the facts for themselves. They can come to Israel. We can share with them everything that we have on the humanitarian assistance we're providing, what has happened day after day since the beginning of the war. I think if they follow the facts, Israel will be seen as being completely innocent of all these charges.
Let me just ask you this. A fellow War Cabinet member, Benny Gantz, said at the weekend that personal and political considerations have begun to enter the most sacred parts of Israel's defence. Was he suggesting that Mr. Netanyahu is using the war to hold on to power?
I don't know what he was suggesting. I mean, Mr. Gantz, I respect him. He's a political rival of the prime minister. There's internal Israeli politics. The prime minister, I've been in the war cabinet since the beginning of the war, and he's led it with the best interests of the country in mind to dismantle Hamas as a military organization, to end its political rule in Gaza, to make sure that Gaza no longer poses a threat to us, and to bring back our hostages. That's how he has led this war. And I think, and maybe it'll take 20 years or 50 years for all the protocols to come out of what happened in the war cabinet. But when people see it, they will understand that Netanyahu is leading the country, is leading the state of Israel in the best interests of the country.
Has the Prime Minister pursued his war aims at the expense of freeing the Israeli hostages who remain in Gaza?
Not at all. I think actually doing our military operation early in the war is what enabled that first hostage deal. Unfortunately, we didn't get to a second hostage deal. There was a proposal that was put on the table several weeks ago. The Americans, I think the Secretary of State said, look, it's a very generous offer. It would have been difficult politically, but the Prime Minister was prepared to push it through the Security Cabinet and the government of Israel, which ultimately has the vote on that. Unfortunately, Hamas rejected it. Then they put out their own proposal and basically signed their own proposal. That's where we are now. We have continued our military operations in Rafah because, as I said, the goal is to dismantle Hamas's army in Gaza. We hope that we'll have a chance to do another hostage deal and bring all of our hostages home. That's a clear goal of the war, and we hope to achieve it as soon as possible and to bring as many back alive as quickly as we can.
If your goal remains the total destruction of Hamas, and I'm thinking here of the criticism of the way the war is being conducted by your American allies, but if that remains the goal, could this become a never-ending war?
No, I don't think so. And I'll explain the goal also. It's very important for your listeners to understand. Our goal is not to kill every Hamas terrorist in Gaza. That could take years. It could take decades. What we faced on October 7th was not a terror organization. It was a terror army. It has 24 battalions across the Gaza Strip. We are systematically dismantling the army of Hamas. And our goal is to finish that job, to finish the remaining battalions. 4 of the 5 of them are in Rafah. I think then the intense fighting will be behind us. Then what we'll have to do is to continue to do anti-terror fighting operations, but you can do it with much smaller firepower, which will actually keep civilians much safer. And you'll have to continue to do these operations for some time to come. The hope will be that after you finish the heavy fighting in Gaza, the possibility of getting an alternative government to emerge will be real, because no one will come into Gaza. They talk about the day after, what's going to happen to Hamas. You got to finish off Hamas. If no one thinks that you're going to finish off Hamas, no one will come in and take over Gaza. We don't want to run Gaza. Obviously, we can't allow Hamas to run Gaza. We need a Palestinian civilian alternative to do it. To get that to happen before Hamas's army is effectively dismantled is impossible. That's why I'm confident that in the weeks ahead, we will finish that job of dismantling the army. And then I think you're going to see a lot of discussion about the alternative government that can emerge in Gaza and hopefully create a different future.
Now, and just finally, you've argued vigorously that the situation for the civilians in Gaza is not what we see on our nightly news. It's not a view shared by your allies. Right now, as the ICC decides whether to issue these arrest warrants, protests against Israel are growing in many parts of the world. Your allies are critical of you. Your friends are critical of you. 3 countries, Norway, Ireland and Spain, have just recognised a Palestinian state. Has Israel ever been more isolated?
I don't think Israel is isolated. I think we've had times in the past, I think we have relations with maybe 160 countries. We've had times in the past during war where this is generally what happens. Remember, this is the longest war that Israel's had since our War of Independence. I think a lot of people see those pictures. I think it affects public opinion. I didn't say that the situation is good in Gaza. I said Israel's not guilty of war crimes in Gaza. That's different. It's a war zone. And when in a war zone, there's suffering of people. And we don't see civilian, from our point of view, civilian suffering in Gaza is a tragedy. For Hamas, it's a strategy of warfare. As to the decision to recognize a Palestinian state, I think, frankly, it is shameful. I think the message that you're sending to the Palestinians is that October 7th is their Independence Day. If this is what led Norway and Ireland and Spain to make this decision, it is terrible and will undermine the prospects for peace. I think it's very important ultimately to reach a political settlement with the Palestinians, but the way you do it is not by rewarding terrorism. It's not by separating the issue of statehood and the issue of peace. You've basically given a prize to Palestinian terrorists, and that's why Hamas officials came out and blessed this decision. That's all you need to know. This is a great decision for Hamas and a great decision for terrorists all over the world. And I think Norway and Spain and Ireland, I hope if there's an opposition there, I hope they will reverse this decision.
I just need to loop back on something you just said and another question that I asked you earlier. I'm sorry, I just need to clear this up because you said just now that you accept that people in Gaza are suffering, and we were talking before about the children, but you rejected the figures of UNICEF that says that 50,000 children are suffering from acute malnutrition. Do you still deny the suffering of those children?
No, I didn't reject those figures. I don't know those figures. I haven't looked at it. The question was how many deaths there were of malnutrition. I think malnutrition happens in every country. I just told you that it may be shocking for your viewers. I don't know the case of Australia, but I looked it up because I said, what is the normal case where you have malnutrition? 20,000 Americans died of malnutrition 2 years ago. That's obviously terrible, but there's no policy of the United States government to starve its own people.
But do you accept Israel's responsibility for the suffering of those children, for the malnutrition that is being suffered right now by children in Gaza?
I accept that Israel has to always comport itself with international law. As I understand, I'm not an international legal expert, but I understand our responsibility is to ensure and facilitate humanitarian assistance coming in. But Israel should not be held responsible for the fact that Hamas is not actually enabling that humanitarian assistance to reach the people who need it. We'll get those trucks. We'll get all that humanitarian assistance to the borders. We'll get it inside. But unless we actually get an alternative to Hamas, which is going to first require us finishing the military job, then I think the people of Gaza will continue to suffer. Again, I don't want to besmirch UNICEF's work all over the world. I'm saying the situation in Gaza, the reports that come out from UN-related agencies should not be taken as face value. Look at the facts, find out the truth, and I think you'll see a very different story. And Israel that is condemned today may be commended tomorrow.
Thank you for the follow-up, and thank you very much indeed for talking to us this evening.
Thank you.